losing people.
So we can start. I'm chairing this session, and also I'm supposed to make an introductory speech. But beforehand, I just got an information from organizers. So we will finish 5 to 5 because of coming of the Mr. Prime Minister. And please, when this is the end of the session, just to stay in the places you are occupying, and we will wait for the Prime Minister and for the coming of other people who are invited. Additional audience will join us, and the debate of Prime Minister Sobotka and European Union Commissar Jourova will start in some 15 minutes, meaning 10-15 minutes later. Well, that's all I had to say on the beginning. I will remind you towards the end of the session. The subject of our session is very general, and actually what Jacques Rupnik said on the beginning even enlarged the subject of the session, because he was saying that we are supposed to talk about the problem of democracy in Central Europe, which is not exactly in the subject. The subject is very general, Quo Vadis Central Europe. I will tell you a few words about the title, as in the academic discourse. Start with the analysis of the title of the subject, not of the subject. And we are representing 4 countries of Central Europe in the traditional historical terms as used by Milan Kundera and others who wrote in the 80s about Central Europe. So you have Attila Melegh, who represents Hungary, if we can talk about representation. Martin Simecka, to say the truth, I have in program Bratislava, but in my case it's written Paris. You are from Bratislava and Prague, and I am more from Warsaw than from Paris. And you are Ludek Niedermayer is both from Prague and from Brussels, so from the capital, or at least nominally capital of the European Union, and from Prague. So we can cover all 4 countries, but I hope that more than those 4 countries. I'm not presenting you because we have all in the program bio or CV of ours. I will start with the title with a few provocative remarks. I cannot say that I was astonished by the title of our session, Quo Vadis Central Europe, but there are some amazing thoughts I had. First, of course, but this is not amazing at all, about the definition of Central Europe. Even in the 80s, Czech and Hungarians, with the most known in this debate, they thought mostly about the countries which belonged historically to the Habsburgian Empire, more or less. In the case of Poles, for example, Czesław Miłosz, our poet, when he was speaking about Central Europe, what he meant, it was all countries practically between Germany and Russia. So there are different definitions until today. Those differences we can see. More astonishing is Quo Vadis. Quo Vadis, this is maybe conscious or non-conscious allusion to the title of the book, which was on the beginning of the last century quite famous, of Sienkiewicz. He got a Nobel Prize. But it was about the Rome in the time of Neron. But in the same time, practically it was the quotation Quo Vadis Domine. It was from apocryphal Bible. It meant addressed by Paul by Peter, Saint Peter later, to Jesus, "Where are you going, my Lord?" So this is quite interesting if you develop this subject. First, is it Central Europe, Lord? It was a certain point of the time. In the 80s, it was very fashionable title and very important for self-identification, for ID of the region. the objective was quite clear, to separate our countries from Russia, to show that culturally we are elsewhere, we are with the West, and we have cultural particularities, and politically we are rather with the West than certainly with Russia. So he wrote, Kundera wrote an article, famous article then, I don't know to what extent it's known till today, about the century, about the tragedy of Central Europe. Where's the tragedy, and where is the God in this story? Or the Jesus answered to St. Peter, he answered, I'm going to Jerusalem to be the second time crucified. Where was Central Europe crucified, and what would mean the second crucifixion of the Central Europe? I'm finishing with this exegesis, with this analysis of the title. But we can say that, for example, we can consider it metaphorically as a joke that first crucifixion, it was Soviet domination, let's say. What would be the second? What is the source of anxiety? This is quite obvious. The Central Europe today is more and more considered in the West as an alien body, as a region which very particular elements of political culture and political developments. And I think that it will be the subject of our discussion. And also, I think we will talk about migrants, because, of course, it plays an important role. The attitudes towards the migrants in the Central Europe is one of the reasons why in the Western Europe there is quite bad press concerning our countries. So we have a few dimensions of this particularity, let's say, of Central Europe. One, connected with authoritarian tendencies, which are quite clear in the case of Hungary, of Orban, and in the case of Poland, of Kaczynski. But it also is mentioned some tendencies in Slovakia, even in Croatia, if we can join Croatia to Central Europe. And in the case of Czech Republic, only one name is mentioned, usually when the problem of authoritarian tendencies are evoked. Let's say this ambiguous attitudes of the West towards our countries, it's the third wave, although those waves were very different. The first was already in '89, when our countries aspired to join the West, as the famous formula which was used at that time, used and abused to join the West. It meant Europe, but it meant also United States, or even more, maybe United States for the security problems. And then the attitude was very, very ambiguous. I remember the conference in Paris organized by President Mitterrand at the time. It was Europe and barbarians were our countries beside others. It was the attitudes there at the gates, as in the famous poem. It was written. So the attitude was ambiguous. It was about democratic tradition and our region, with maybe partial exception of Czechoslovakia, of Masaryk, with difference of Czechoslovakia, certainly was a region where democratic tradition were not present. The second, economic underdevelopment. The third, of course, all post-Soviet heritage. This is why there was no, let's say, an enthusiasm for the idea of our countries joining the European Union, with maybe the exception of Great Britain, because Great Britain preferred it than deepening, than further integration of the core countries of European Union. The second wave, which was very small and forgotten already, it was when economic crisis started. And then in the West, there was quite a number of articles which were published that the danger for European Union, economic danger for European Union can come with our countries, banking irresponsibility, the financing and so on. As we know, our countries, with an exception which was not connected with the crisis really, with the Hungarian exception, was rather very successful. Very successful to the point that, for example, Polish foreign minister, ex-foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, who was even saying that we moved from the east and we joined the north, not the west, but the north, you know, Scandinavian countries and Great Britain from the point of view of financial, economic responsibilities. So this wave was short, and our countries were considered as a success story of integration, of development. It's very different with the third wave, which is connected directly with appearance first of Orban's phenomenon. And as you remember, maybe in the summer, in July 2014, during the conference to Hungarians, but in Romania, he was even speaking in a positive way about illiberal democracy as an alternative to liberal democracy. And he was giving just examples of Russia, China, and Turkey as a positive example, that liberal, with the crisis of liberal democracy, this is not really a model. And the same we have in Poland, although Kaczynski, quite surprisingly, this time is cautious enough not to use such a term, but already 10 years ago, he used a formula which was very interesting, which is, you can understand probably in all languages, impossibilism, impossible. What he meant by impossibility is that you cannot really exercise political power with all the constraints of liberal democracy. Constraints, both institutional and legal constraints. So his objective already then, as now, and as an objective of Orban, it was to eliminate or at least to weaken all those liberal constraints like constitutional court, like independence of central bank, like human rights and all legal systems, just to have sort of Jacobinian republic or in philosophical terms, Rousseauist republic where political process is not limited, that it's not anti-democratic. It is, in a way, democratic, in that sense that the moment the power is elected, is accepted by the people, representing the people, they can do whatever they wish. This is practically the logic, although, of course, they cannot go to the end of their project. There are limits, there are constraints, both external and internal. But this is practically the project. We will discuss, I think, later during our debates, because we have eminent specialists of other countries, to what extent we can speak about at least certain elements of the same development in other countries in the region. At least in the West, generally, whole region now is perceived as a liberal, which is tempted by this illiberal or autocratic tendency. Before I would talk more about Central Europe, I think that there is wide exaggeration in the perception in the West. I don't want to minimize the importance of the phenomenon of authoritarianism and also anti-migrants feelings, but we have the same phenomenon in the West, although that's true that in our countries, at least certain countries, this tendency is much stronger present, and at least in two countries of our region, we have the people who openly declare anti-liberal program. In the West, we have strong forces. And in one country, in Austria, there was even a danger recently that a representative of extreme right would become president. And there is a danger of Madame Le Pen being elected, for example, in France, although I don't think it's very serious danger. But still, those movements, they exist everywhere in Europe. And as we know, with example of Trump, we have it in United States as well. So the question is, of course, very interesting. Is it the difference of quality or of quantity? And what are the sources of this difference? We can say that as far as the problem of migrants is concerned, we were discussing a lot beforehand. Here as well, I can see the difference rather of quantity than quality. We have very strong, with exception of a few countries, we have quite strong tendency against accepting more migrants. And as we know that in spite of Mrs. Merkel and Brussels' pressure upon all countries of Europe, very few migrants who arrived to Greece or to Italy were accepted in other countries. You know, the difference is quite often that the language used in our region, included by some presidents, prime minister, it's such brutal and quite often racist that in the West it wouldn't be possible in the case even of extreme right parties. I'm not talking about small groups, extreme right. There always exist fascist groups. But legalist extreme right, for example, Madame Le Pen, I know, knowing very well France, I know much about her. She would never use such a language. She will be against accepting more migrants, but she will be absolutely for recognizing the whole full rights of the people of Muslims who are already in France, not to speaking about citizens of France. So what we hear in our region, but this is this is quite often this is the problem of language. This is quite an interesting question. To what extent this is the problem of language, or we have real substantial differences? Now about the concept of Central Europe, this is very interesting. It was very popular in the 80s. More in Czech Republic, in Slovak Republic, in Hungary, than in Poland. In Poland, it was never very popular. Poles identified themselves directly with Europe. All they thought about those old countries between Germany and Russia. Actually, this is the political program of this government. If there is anything original in the vision of foreign policy of this government, of peace of Mr. Kaczynski, this is so-called of idea of ABC in Polish. In English, I would tell ABB, meaning Adriatic, Baltic Sea, Black Sea, meaning about the alliance of all those countries practically between Russia and Germany. Of course, it will be never said openly that this is both against Russia and against Germany, or against Western European Union. But of course, this is the content. This is the content. This is the content of this idea. Or why this idea of Central Europe is back? And it's quite obviously very different from the idea, noble idea, which was very much present among dissidents. And in the West, actually, it was quite influential in the West of Central Europe in the 80s. Then it was a noble idea of liberation of the countries, of independence of the nations, independence of their culture, political integration of the West. Or today, to a big extent, there is a lot of opposition towards this idea. Today, this is true. This is implicitly against Russia, even if Orban has very good, not only Orban and President Zeman, for the first time I will mention, for the last time I will mention this name, have very good relation with Putin. Still, fundamentally, I do believe that, politically, that those countries which is unifying them in this project of Central Europe or Visegrad Group, this is institutional the emanation of the idea of Central Europe. This is against Russia, but not only. This is against civilization from the East. This is also against civilization from the South. This is anti-Islamic, very strongly, and it plays even stronger role. This is the common denominator and common objective of those countries. This is to fight against any obligation to accept people from Arabic countries or from Afghanistan, from Islamic countries. So it plays a very important role. And the third, quite surprisingly, this is also the subject of discussion. I would like to hear your opinion because my knowledge is limited. This is also against the West. This is quite obvious in the case of Poland. You have now the discourse, anti-Western, that the West today, this is the declining West, this is the moralization of the West, this is postmodern, this is multiculti with homosexual marriages. This is very popular, especially in the camp which governs today Poland, among the people of the right. This is very popular language. We never had it. It was always the dream in Poland to join the West. We never had Slovanophiles, like they were quite popular at a certain period here. In Poland, never. Poles were anti-Russian. Today, they are not pro-Russians, but they are quite anti-Western. That in reality, we are representing traditional, real values of the West. But you see how the use of this idea changed very, very much. This is connected very much with the fact that there's no anymore illusions concerning the West, and this is the consequence of economic crisis. This is not anymore, the West is not anymore role model, and imitation is not anymore the strategy which is adopted. Once again, I hope we will discuss it. It's not the strategy which is openly, at least, adopted by the countries of the region. And the second, of course, we discussed about it, this is the problem of Schengen, of open borders. This is very interesting that in public opinion polls, once again, this is the case I know better than others, in Poland, there was more than 70% of the young people, meaning between 18 and 24, who are against Schengen. So the demographic category which take advantage more than any other categories, but because of fear of migration. So this anti-Western turn is also connected with questioning two the most important elements of the West as we've seen it in 89 and later. This is the Western political system and economic system, and the open frontier, the principle of open borders. Pardon? Yeah, I will finish. I will finish in a second. So I will say if you. Well, of course, there's a large subject. Maybe we can discuss it later. This is the elements of this authoritarian system and the origin of the authoritarian system. But maybe I will. This is certain historical tradition. I mentioned Soviet heritage, weak new institution, weak civil society, costs of the transition, which is quite often underestimated, especially in the countries like Poland, where those costs were very high, and against elites, the feeling, very strong feelings against the elites, which reinforces authoritarian tendency in the people who are aspiring, you know, to country. I will quote to finish this part my you know, my chief at the French Academy of Science, great scholar Raymond Aron. I was political immigré then, and I made an interview with him in the middle of the 70s. I was asking then why the French are so revolted against the situation where after several decades after the war of the big successes. And he told me this is the successes of 25 last years are much bigger than of previous 100 or 150 years. But in the same time, people suffered. A lot of people suffered. And of course, there was always certain injustice. You cannot avoid it in the social, political, economic, very complex problems. Or people do forget very quickly the advantages what they received as a consequence of those changes. They are revolting themselves against the injustice and what they perceive as an injustice of the situation. And we can see this is also one of the origins, certainly, of authoritarian temptation. Well, I will finish here, and I will ask you in alphabetic order to take a floor. No, you are the first, Attila.
Yeah, but I've already spoken, so I would allow them to.
So why? But here you are for the first time in this panel. If you wish, we can change. Ludek, we can start with Hungary.
Okay. After some discussion with Martin, we agreed that we will speak Czech. So sorry for those who prefer to the English, but to balance it. So, takže.
So, I'll speak Czech. First of all, I can say I'm very happy to have been invited to participate in this panel, and I'm very happy that we're discussing world issues in a global context, in a very wide context. And this is a context that is very important for us, for our countries, for the Visegrad Group countries. This is a very, very important topic indeed, because in this part of the world a lot has been going on lately, and precisely that is why we should not forget that also in all the other regions of the world a lot is going on as well. Jan Verich used to say that if nothing was going on there would be no history, but at this point particularly I would say that maybe even too much is going on. And which is why I will be focusing on the recent development in the European context. And that's very important because it has a lot to do with my personal work, but also because I think that our future is based on the contemporary concept of the European Union. That is a concept that we should consider useful, that we should consider to be something that should be preserved. Because as far as alternatives are concerned, I cannot really imagine a very different concept of the world. And recently we've seen that even the British, who have historically never been a very strongly integrated country, I mean integrated with the other countries on the continent, and their standards of living have been very high. Well, we've seen that even the British cannot actually explain to their voters what the future of Britain would be without Europe, without the EU. So I'll be focusing on the European context, as I said, and it's interesting that in the Czech Republic, among politicians as well as entrepreneurs and people who are not that interested in politics, everybody seems to sort of presume that in the European context, the Visegrad countries are concerned to be, let's say, uniform, they are considered to be partners in crime, so to speak. But I think it's not really the case, because there are not a lot of topics on which the Visegrad 4 countries would be able to agree. Recently, one of those cases was the refugee crisis, but it happened mainly because there's been this huge change in Poland after the recent election. Donald Tusk's party used to have a different view of issues. And also another point is that we want to gain as much money from cohesion funds as possible. That's another issue on which we've been able to agree, basically. And that's also, there's another point on which we agree, which is the possible enlargement of the EU in the Balkans. But there are, well, strategic, political, financial issues, a lot of other issues where we do not always agree. And also, a lot of people assume that Visegrad 4 countries are not considered to be very important or influential, because you need 4 countries as a minimum to do something in the EU. That's true, that's what we have, but you also need 35% of votes, and that's there, you know, the V4 countries are not enough. We still need 14 or 15 more percent of votes. And if we were to find a single country to make up for those 14% of votes, we would only have, the only country that would help would be Germany. Otherwise, France on its own, the UK on its own would not really be enough. And I don't think we actually realize this. And now allow me a quick overview of what's been happening. I spend 3 to 4 days a week outside of the Czech Republic, and therefore I would say that actually I've been able to identify more differences rather than similarity as far as the V4 countries are concerned. I think that very often our top representatives, political representatives, are very pro-European. They are not worried, not afraid to say how good Europe is for us, for the Czech Republic. But they're, you know, very they like to say that behind closed doors. Recently, I heard a very good pro-European speech by the Prime Minister, Czech Prime Minister, that was only given to a very limited audience. And I think, you know, that's what makes us different from the other V4 countries, and there are quite a lot of political differences, even at the very highest level. For example, let's say our view of our role in the NATO, within NATO. You know, the V4 countries view their membership in the NATO very differently. Poland, for example, is a country which has become very ambitious in the within the EU. And they think they're an influential country. They think they're more important, let's say, than Hungary and Czech Republic. Say, as far as Hungary is concerned, well, the main political motive of their representation is to serve their own interest, so they could stay in power as long as possible, for as long as possible. And I think we, as the Czech Republic, are more pro-European, let's say, but citizens tend to be anti-European to a large extent. That has a lot to do with the former president, Václav, but also the current president, who came to power, who became the president as a Euro-optimist, self-proclaimed, but nowadays his position has changed to a certain extent. And the Slovakia is different because it is a member of the Eurozone, which is why they must be interested in the Eurozone working properly, more so than the rest of us. And so, to come back to the very first point I made, unity is hard to achieve. And once it is achieved, if it is only limited to the V4 countries and a few friends, it's not really that important. What is the problem of the Czech Republic, the main issues of the Czech Republic? I think we've sort of still, you know, forgotten to actually enter the EU. Recently somebody said this as a joke, meaning that, you know, we've not really psychologically entered the EU yet, but it's very clear sometimes, because even, you know, and sometimes very high-level politicians are likening the refugee crisis and the solutions around it to the Munich agreement, you know, being negotiated without us, about us. And some politicians have suggested that in some matters it would actually be much better for us to vote in a completely different composition of members than the EU treaties presume. And that shows that some of our representatives either really want to mystify citizens as to what rules we've actually pledged to follow, or they don't really understand what our membership really means. Now, there is another issue that is very problematic to us, the Czech Republic, I mean, and that is that we're not very consensual and we don't really try very hard to reach a consensus. We have 101 governmental deputies in the parliament, and the governing coalition tries very hard to make sure that they're all voting in line with the official government position. And they don't really try to engage the opposition very much. However, in the EU you cannot work this way, because there is no official governing coalition, no official opposition. Coalitions actually are created ad hoc, and people at the negotiating table must try really hard to understand what motivates the others. And they must try to understand that the others sometimes have very good reasons why they have the interests they do have. And so, you know, following this logic whereby we think that our position is the only correct one and the others are trying to sabotage us or undermine us by having a different opinion, that's not very helpful at all, and we risk becoming a very unhelpful, unreliable partner to the others in the EU. And that also infects Czech citizens, because then, unsurprisingly, Czech citizens tend to take the same kind of a position, and that is manifested in opinion polls. I don't think this is a permanent stage. I think this is going to change. I think Czechs like to be Europeans and want to remain Europeans, and I'm nearing the end of my speech now, because this has not been the case only in the V4 countries or Central Europe. But to be politically correct, let's say, these problems have been manifesting everywhere, basically. Very strong populism, for example, especially at times of trouble, a rise of very aggressive nationalist parties. And by nationalism, I don't mean people supporting the national football team, but really strong nationalist tendencies. And hand in hand with that is usually very strong anti-Europeanism. And that's usually the stance taken over by political parties that are not very strong, that don't really have any other agenda apart from being anti-EU. And you can see very good evidence of that when you take a look at what parties actually support the anti-EU camp. If we're unable to reach agreement within the EU, well, then we become less credible, of course, because the critics of the system then point out the fact that we're unable to agree on anything and the system is not working at all. And of course, it's not really tolerance, but let's say our ability to understand the so-called troublemakers is on the decline too, because it's so difficult to actually negotiate about anything, and therefore we become, let's say, less tolerant or less understanding of those who are unwilling to compromise. Now we have the issue of Brexit that actually might change the setup of Europe in the future. There are a lot of questions relating to the future architecture of our continent, and that is why we need to be united. We need to come together and solve all these issues together, and that's quite a problem. So I'm a bit afraid that in the future, I think, if we overdo this and if we keep insisting on our positions, if we keep insisting on still being the, let's say, the freeloaders on the system, if we don't try to reach a compromise with the others, it might have very negative and serious consequences for us. Let me mention a few examples. For example, the, let's say, Cameron architecture of the flexible Europe. I think we personally would not really, this would not really be a win-win situation for us, because European integration would become much less important. The main focus would then shift to the Eurozone, which we're not members of. And for Europeans, according to opinion polls, the EU means, first of all, the Euro and the Schengen system without border controls, which has been challenged very much by the current migration crisis. And also there is the concept of solidarity, which also seems to be very complicated, because if you are asking others to have solidarity with you and are at the same time you are unwilling to show solidarity vis-à-vis others, it's complicated. We're talking about future risks. Of course, the situation in Poland and Hungary is quite serious. I'm not in a position to make any conclusions, but I think this is dangerous, and it's much more dangerous than we think, and it's against our interests. Thank you.
Martin, maybe you.
Takže budu
Let me continue. Let me follow up. Aleksander's statement. I'm thinking of what happened to Central Europe. Although I think that the situations in various countries differ, but there's something they have in common, apart from being the troublemakers in the eyes of the West. Central Europe, as if it would be returning to the 30s of the past century, and that's not helpful. What is typical for Central Europe is language, as mentioned by Aleksander. Each of us uses a different language, but this is a language of brutality used by politicians in a way that would be unthinkable in the West. Radical right does not dare to use this language in the West. How comes we have become this rude? This probably expresses the overall social atmosphere in these countries. People dare to say things you wouldn't say, things that are not said. I would love to know the answer, but I'm probably not sure I can provide you with an explanation. There is one thing in common in all of our countries. We have built capitalism, but we felt that the democracy will grow itself without our contribution, without our investment, without our effort to create a society. We were led to believe that the democracy will bring in the values. This is not right. We have wasted 25 years building capitalism, and we have neglected common things like education and discourse on what does it mean to live in a society, to think of human dignity, to debate human dignity. We haven't done that. Let me mention the example of Slovakia, but I think it is relevant for the Czech Republic as well. Of course, 1989, then Mečiar came in, and there was a struggle for democracy, followed by the reformist government of Mikuláš Dzurinda. And they've only used the money language, neoliberal agenda, as it is called today. It was the try to push on the idea of liberalist development. Then Fico came in for another 8 years. He pretends to be a social democrat, but he only used the money language, saying that the poor should get higher salaries, low-income groups should get higher salaries. But we have not debated a society and its function. One generation has grown up without hearing that society functions based on particular principles like human dignity, compassion, helping each other. These are the terms that have not been debated. And then we can't be surprised seeing that 8% of young generations, those who went to the elections for the first time, voted for local Nazi Kotleba. They never heard about a Slovak state during the Second World War, as the education simply has left it at the margin. We have forgotten about the soft power of democracy, without which democracy falls. This is a joint experience of Central European countries, and the language brutality of the politicians is based on the fact that nobody raises their eyebrows and nobody is taken by surprise, nobody questions this. So this is a joint problem of Central Europe. And speaking about language does not mean that I'm not addressing reality. Reality is based on the language. Words are dangerous. Everything starts with the language. We know that it is so since the Balkan Wars, etc. In Central Europe, we can see the split today, which is obvious, probably not to the West. Poland and Hungary took the path to the neoliberal regimes. We can see the Hungarian drama, and the society there has become apathetic, and there's probably no force that would be able to change it. In Poland, people still resist, but we will see what will be the Polish combat for democracy. And the difference between Hungary, Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic is the following. We have very many populists. The language is the same. It is very brutal. However, our countries compared to Poland and Hungary are liberal or liberal democratic, and this should be stressed. This should be highlighted. Czech Republic is better off than Slovakia thanks to its good judiciary system and institutions like Constitutional Court. And even in Slovakia, although the Prime Minister Fico is a prototype of a man who does not like democracy and freedom. And we cannot say that in Slovakia, democracy and liberal institutions would be devastated by Fico. There is a freedom of speech. He never banned any media. He never took over any media. The public broadcasting is much better off. And it is a paradox. He simply can't be bothered. He doesn't want to take over in the media. And in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia, we can still talk about liberal democratic regimes. And let me say, what is the difference between Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic and Slovakia? It is ideology indeed. Both Kaczynski and Orbán do know precisely what is the historical ideas and policies behind the neoliberal state, and they are able to communicate this to their electorate because they have a rich history in this respect. While in the Czech and Slovak republics there is no such history. In the Czech Republic it's very different. The social narrative in the Czech Republic, which includes one single idea, Masaryk Republic. This is still a break that stops us from entering into a neoliberal sphere or regime. And in Slovakia as well, because Slovakia has no history at all, their social narrative is weaker, but they still remember the First Republic, and people still are very much against Mečiar. This is a recent history indeed. However, it makes it impossible for the authoritarians to build up an ideological basis and intellectual basis for their political ideas. As neither in the Czech Republic nor in the Slovakia you see no, or you meet no intellectuals or groups who would support neoliberal ideas. While in Poland and Hungary there are cohorts of intellectuals, journalists and others who do support Kaczynski and Orbán and who offer ideological fundament for that. So this is our hope, and that's why we can't talk about a single phenomenon that would be called Central Europe.
Thank you very much, and Attila would thank us.
Okay, yes. So I would like to make 3 points related to the very interesting remarks we have been listening to. The first one, it would be really something, because some people might say that I'm very pessimistic. In some ways I'm not. So when we are talking about these societies, we always say civil societies, weak, and so on and so on. Nonetheless, wherever I go, I see a tremendous amount of work on behalf of these people, which are very much related to this idea, original idea of Central Europe. So I'm a member of the Hungarian Europe Society, and various people work really very hard to go with this. And then also with regard to the migrant crisis, this is something very important I would like to stress, that regardless of the public discourses, regardless of the things what senior politicians are saying, we have to make it very clear that people are really doing something. So in that sense, that these societies do not have an idea of autonomy, that's anybody who says that is wrong, and I really would like to stress it in the beginning. Nonetheless, at the same time, on the level of the elite, there are very serious problems. Sorry, I do not want to be too sarcastic. You said second crucifixion, and actually it reminded me, with regard to this authoritarian state, it reminded me of Life of Brian, when there is this guy standing and says, crucifixion, yes, jolly good, just go ahead, turn right, take your own cross, and next please, and then crucifixion, no, liberty, okay, okay, and that's what, liberty, and then said, okay, okay, crucifixion. So, which means that these societies, nonetheless, on an elite level, have some very serious problems. And then I would like to give some points in this respect, mainly based on Hungary, because the Hungarian case is significantly different even from the Polish case in a lot of ways. But there are some similarities which we can think about. So what's the problem around the elite? The major problem around the elite is that, at least in Hungary, the elite has been divided rather significantly for a rather long time. Now, this is not just, nice ideological debate. It is very much about resources. So basically, there was a very quote-unquote, as it was put it in at that time, organic Hungarian transition. That is to say, there was a rather shift move toward liberal capitalism, and then resources were reorganized, first of all, toward transnational investors, plus, very importantly, certain inner groups. Now, this inner group has also got very important positions, and then this is when this younger generation, which according to them did not get enough, then they questioned this. And in the beginning they failed because they thought that they could regain certain things. That was the first Orban regime in some ways. But for the next time, they learned certain things. And I would like to stress certain elements which are important. The first thing is they understood that in case the media is not strictly controlled, then all those attempts when they fight for this reallocation would fail, because then media would revolt, they would be questioned, and then really this is one thing they wanted to avoid. The second, they understood that they needed some kind of popular sentiment. I would call passive revolution, in case I'm thinking about an Italian philosopher. So some kind of a passive mobilization of people which supports the elite in the fight. And then this is how they invented two things, basically. First of all, they reinvented this problem of insecurity, meaning, very clearly, we can talk a lot about this, meaning that we defend you. So all these previous workers and all these people who have not come out very well, and be aware of the thing that Hungary, as opposed to Poland, lost relative positions, right? So because of this lack of success, because of losing 1.5 million jobs, which actually was the Hungarian record, a lot of insecurity, and they were telling, we are going to defend you. This was one. The second one was that we are going to defend you even against the West. And that was the two things which they invented somewhere around the early 2005, 6, and then this is how they started the campaign. Why is it important? Because they needed this kind of a background in order to start the fight for reallocation. And when they got into power, then this is, in some ways, this is, in my view, the source of authoritarian state. The authoritarian state is when the elite, or one group of the elite, captures it for the sake of reallocations, and it needs the authoritarian state to reallocate because it has already been allocated, right? In that sense, that's also in some ways the Putin phenomenon. That is to say, when a group comes and says, okay, I'm going to fight against this previous elite, but I will use the state. Now this, of course, by definition, cannot be a liberal state, because a liberal state would not intervene into property issues. It would not retake property in order to reallocate it and then do things, or to what they did with regard to the private pensions, and so on and so on. There were many problems. Of course, they had a sharp eye on certain things, but I think that is some kind of a problem. And then this leads to these, impossibilities, right? So we are not following this. Nonetheless, what is frightening in this, that with this, all the time they are playing with the spirit, right? The spirit is coming out of the battle, and nobody really knows whether the spirit can go back or no. My bet is that with them, the spirit is not going to go back, because that is done. And I think that they have a definite interest in maintaining some kind of a hysteria in order to run the business as it goes. It reminds me, we had this very nice talk on Macedonia. I was listening, oh, I know this quite well. So that, I think, is very important, and then this is what we need to think about. Why they can do it? Now, there are certain things which are indirectly supporting these things. And in that sense, I would be a little bit critical toward this idea of Central Europe as well. Allow me, for the sake of better. The idea of Central Europe originally was the following, that I remember Kundera's piece, not only one, but several of his pieces, this kidnap West, right? That is to say, it's a kind of a mental mapping which goes like that, that we look at the West, we should be like them, and at the same time, so it's a kind of a hierarchical positioning toward them, at the same time, we are looking down the others, right? So this is with regard to the Balkans, right? So the concept of Central Europe got legitimate criticism from some thinkers coming from, let's say, Bulgaria, and so on. What is really the trap here? The trap here is that this kind of a Central Europe is too much focusing on Europe, and it is unable to get out of this fight for prestige. That is to say, and this is what Orban is actually using very often, that is to say, he comes back and says, come on, there are two reasons why we are not respected as other European nations. One is that the bloody communists, they pushed us away. In case we would not have had the communists, we would be safe. This is the kind of a historicizing argument. And the other one is that, and this reminds me of the early 1990s of far right in Hungary, which means that the West is colonizing us, and then we are fighting some kind of an anti-colonial war. So this kind of a hierarchical positioning is a key element in creating some kind of an ideology. The very last thing I would like to add, in order not to take too much time, that somehow also very interestingly, these societies have this mental imagination, not because they are bad in mental imagination, but because certain structures also push them into this direction. And the very last point I would like to make is with regard to migration itself. In case you do a real nice comparative analysis, how Central and Eastern Europe is integrated into migratory flows, then you come to very interesting conclusions. First, for a very long time, they have been sending rather clearly a big number of emigrants, changing number, but big number of emigrants toward very specific countries. So that Hungary has been sending people to North America, Germany and Austria. This is a fact even under state socialism, right? And then in that sense, this is, as we talked about, this is an emigrant region. But at the same time, when you look at how they compensate, if they compensate in terms of immigration, then you can see that basically this region is taking migrants from each other. That is to say, within the region. So this region is very much confined into us and the West kind of a hierarchical thinking. And I think this would be something very important. And the last thing which I heard very nicely, somebody reminded me during the lunch, and I love that point very much, that here, then we always present ourselves as victims, but when it comes to responsibility, then we immediately shy away, and we have no responsibility for migrants, for global inequality, nothing, because basically we are trying to get, take caring of our internal hierarchies instead of really looking around, thinking about the world freely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have unfortunately only 20 minutes now, so please, questions and very short comments. Yes, please.
Jan Schinagel.
Jan Schinagel, I'll be brief. In November 2013, 75% of the MPs of the Czech Republic have elected chairman of the Communist Party, Mr. Filip, as vice chair of the parliament. It was an anonymous vote. Our constitution stipulates that the communist regime is a criminal regime. This is something that might be compared to the hypothetical situation NSDAP being on German parliament. Mr. Simecka said that democracy needs democrats, and democrats are generated by democratic society. And if there is no democratic society, we need leaders. Leaders may be charismatic and enlightened. That's one option. The second option is Mr. Kotleba. So the youngsters voted for motivation, for a role model. So why don't we consider, in the frame of democracy, people, leaders who will reflect on people's wish? I'm talking to very many people, and people are telling us, we don't care. It might be Hitler or enlightened future, but we have to do something, otherwise the democracy destroys itself. Singapore is the example.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Děkuji moc krát všem
Thank you very much to all the panelists for very interesting speeches on the differences and similarities in Central Europe. I think we all sort of feel that our history, our present and our experience has a big influence on the way we view the current events, and they have a lot to do with the risks that democracy in Central Europe is facing now. But I'm afraid there is one thing that we have in common, and that is a mistrust that we've inherited from the past. Mistrust vis-à-vis institutions. Because in the past, we used to perceive as institutions as instruments of the regime, which were not independent of the rulers, let's say. And if we take a look at what's been happening recently in all of the Central European countries, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, the attacks against democracy always begin as attacks on institutions, being media, the constitutional court, or disrespecting a verdict, a ruling of a court, and so on and so forth. And recently, we have seen disruption of some constitutional freedoms, such as freedom of assembly or freedom of speech. So don't you think that this institutional problem that we've had is far bigger than this problem we have with individual people or differences between the individual countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, we have still a few minutes, but not more. Yes, there is. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Earlier, when talking about the Balkans, and the name of William Faulkner was brought up. True. The Balkans as something like Europe's version of the Mississippi Delta. But it reminded me of this, another term by another exiled Czech author, a bit less famous than Milan Kundera, for the region, which was to call Central Europe Middle West Europe, which in some ways I think is an opposite term because it does reflect the relationship, say, between the core areas of Europe to the west, the sort of heartland, and then the violent and dangerous places down south, in a kind of bad mapping of America. But on the other hand, it brings up another question. The relationship of Central Europe to the West that existed in the 80s, of a turn towards a West that was a kind of unified, reified, solid object, at a time when the West was beginning to question itself, to question its colonial past, and become much more of a pluralistic, even ethnically pluralist and historically pluralist society. And of course, in the 1990s, as I remember myself, there was a lot of much worse white supremacist rhetoric out there, I don't even call it discourse, of we didn't deserve this, we're white people. I'm referring to communism. This is my question. To what extent would you say that the immediate post-communist elites in culture and politics have a certain responsibility for the current state of affairs in Central Europe in terms of helping to have cultivated this idea of us as being the real West? And to what degree should these elites take responsibility for what they did? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think we will turn towards panelists. Milan.
Já jenom o tom, že...
Well, just to your comment, you were saying that, yes, somebody must bring the house in order. Well, that's a good example from a joke, let's say. There's a herd of sheep and a wolf is following, and the sheep then decide, okay, let's elect the wolf because he'll bring the herd in order at long last. Well, what Michal Żantowski said is actually interesting, because on the one hand, yes, we have in the Czech Republic attacks, for example, on the public media, the Czech state-owned Czech TV. And it's not a coincidence, because Orbán, when he came to power, he changed the constitutional court immediately. In Poland, once the new government was elected, they attacked the constitutional court. That was the first thing they do. So these non-democratic politicians know very well what they're doing, but that is why they actually realize that these institutions, such as the constitutional courts, already have some trust. People trust them. So we've been successful in building them up in a way. Of course, there is a danger of these institutions being destroyed, but still, in the Czech Republic at least, this is a good example of us being able to build up these institutions that are actually trustworthy over the past 25 years. If you want to attack someone or an institutions, well, Orbán and Kaczynski had a very good plan of who to attack and how to attack these institutions. They had a very good idea, and they know how to basically change all the institutions, how to put all their people in the important positions. But in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, there are no such plans, no such idea. Zeman doesn't have it, Babiš, in my opinion, doesn't have it. And that's the case in Slovakia too. Not even Fico. None of them actually have a concrete plan for replacing the liberal regime with a neoliberal model. Because you need a plan like that. You need ideas to follow. And, well, I'm not saying this is not going to happen ever in the future, but I think at this point in Czech Republic and Slovakia, there is no such imminent danger. Of course, I'm not saying that these attacks on democratic institutions are not dangerous, of course. Well, if I may, just a few comments on this, because I really like this example with the wolf. And it actually ties up to what I said earlier. we've not been able to actually explain to people over these 20 years that democracy is worth it, actually, even though it's not perfect, it's, well, pricey sometimes. And we've not been able to explain this to people because we don't really talk about values. We miss these values, and that's something that Martin actually mentioned. We cannot replace values with money. And on what Michal Żantowski said, I think with institutions it's quite difficult. We've woken up from communism, we mistrust institutions, but I think at the beginning of the 1990s we then built this mistrust all over again, because the institutions, the new institutions back then, did not have very far-reaching competences and powers. Of course, you know, there were not that many competent people. The competent people usually went to the private sector. And the other very important factor is corruption, which was back then very widely tolerated. And that's what actually made people disillusioned, because they sort of felt like the society would never change. And this is why Poland is so interesting, because in Poland, I think these two factors were not that present back then. So back here, in the past, we actually diminished trust and confidence in institutions twice, 2 times in a row. And that's what actually made it possible to create this new concept of institutional engineering. In Poland, the problem was that Kaczynski actually did not reach constitutional majority. There's one thing I disagree with. I think we're much closer to the West than we actually think. That's why I said in the 1990s that we used to say back then that if you want to go from Prague to Vienna, you have to go to the west, quite far to the west, rather than east. Anyway, very often I hear, for example, when Czech MPs actually voted for the possibility for us to organize a Czechsit referendum. Well, I think we're a very small country, and that means that we're facing risks that other bigger countries don't actually face.
Attila.
Yes, just very quickly, I don't want to take time. I think Mika's question is very important. I would like to add 3 things. One, these states, including Poland and Hungary, they have really faced real problems. That is to say, we should not deny that there were no problems, for instance, with foreign currency loans. That was an insane system which could not be maintained. Also the same thing, the private-public pension scheme was very problematic because just very simply from the point of view of state bookkeeping, it meant that the state collected something for private organizations and then it appeared as a spending of the government, and then actually, you know, budget deficits, you could be penalized on this. So that's, I think, these are real problems. The institutional thing comes here because they use these problems for other purposes as well. So these are like Trojan horses. So they use this, and then with this they go in, and then they try doing other things. And then here comes the last point, and they use it for an ideology of a kind of a South Korean race car. That is to say, we will fix everything in a centralized manner, so they get a taste out of this kind of an intervention, and they think that in the longer run it's going to be successful, and people will love it because they will be super successful.
Thank you very much. A few words to end the debate. I think it was very rich. We've seen not only common problems, but also the differences between all 4 countries. I would like to add maybe about Poland and about the problem of values. In Poland, in spite of the fact that the right won elections, more than 80% of Poles were happy with their situation. Almost 90% is pro-European. So in a way, you can say that there are no objective reason for the change of regime. In the same time, you had very high level, more than 70%, against institution, against power. This is typically populist, the division, the people against the power. And you see it in the West as well when we are talking about the particular problems of East Central Europe. We must see that this is sort of dividing line which dominates today, not the left and the right. This is today, let's say, populism, and not even populist parties, even of mainstream parties, against the elite, which is the consequence of what the Anglo-Saxon would call perfect storm, meaning the storm where we have many factors of dramatic events in the same time. So, and the problem of values, I think that this is a major problem, which is largely discussed in Poland. The problem is that the values which are represented usually by the center and the left are very weak today. The values of the right, traditional values, the nation and the religions, they are back also in the West. When we are talking about renationalization, for example, of European policy, tendency to strengthening, although quite weak, nation state, this is the consequence also of the movements from down up, the feeling of the people that they want to have a security of different types of security, foreign policy, social policy, the problem of unemployment, the problem of migration, and so on, from the states which he disposed with very limited resources today. And traditional values of equality, our countries, Europe still is the most egalitarian continent, but still this is the level of unhappiness. This is the consequence also of the crisis. We must remember that we are living in a very particular period which can be compared, fortunately positively compared, to the crisis of the 30s. So the problems with Central Europe, this is also the consequence of the more general tendency we observe in Europe, and not only in Europe, in the United States as well. So let's finish the subject which cannot be finished, and thank you very much for the attention, and thank you very much for the panelists, and we will see in 15 minutes, I believe, we will see Mr. Prime Minister. We were asked to